Hello, my name's Anthony Beery. I'm from Cumberland, Virginia, farming here in Central Virginia, and I believe in soil health because it's the foundation of who we are and what we do. It sustains us with the food we eat and the environment that we live in.
Welcome to another episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii. Eric and Mary will join me in just a moment, but first a quick reminder about the Virginia Farm to Table Harvest Celebration. That is coming up on Saturday evening, October the 25th from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. just outside Harrisonburg, Virginia. It's going to be a beautiful place to be in autumn on a stunning and historic farm, Sunny Slope Farm in Rockingham County. But the Virginia Farm to Table Harvest Celebration is scheduled for Saturday, October the 25th. You can get all the details at the website virginiafarmtotable.org. Now to this week's podcast. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii, and joining me, my co-host, Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition, and Eric Benfelt with Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability. Guys, we have a special guest returning this week. Mary, would you please introduce her?
Thanks, Jeff. We have Summer Thomas back with us this week, the Education Outreach Specialist with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition, and a wonderful background of education and outreach, soil health, agriculture. But I think today we're going to dive a little more into her research background and learn a little bit about the role of livestock in soil health and specifically rotational bale grazing, which it's okay if you don't know what that is going into this, because I'm going to kick things off, Summer, by asking you, what is rotational bale grazing and what does it have to do with your PhD?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to be back. So when we think about rotational bale grazing, that is a winter hay feeding system for beef cattle, usually. So the traditional method when feeding hay in the winter for beef cattle is in a sacrifice paddock system. And the key word there is sacrifice. So traditional methods, cattle would be kept in one location throughout the winter, and they would be brought a new hay bale every few days. And this hay bale is placed in the same exact location each time. And it's called a sacrifice paddock because it really leads to a not so pretty picture. So, cattle are social animals. They're going to spend time around each other, around their food source, and around fence lines. And when you have this sacrifice paddock area where you're putting a hay bale in the same exact spot each time, you get a buildup of manure, and you can have a lot of disturbance in that area. If you're ever driving down the road and you see a paddock where there's a hay ring, oftentimes you can see where there may be no forage growing if that hay bale is continuously placed there. So rotational bale grazing is an alternative. And a lot of producers in the northern Great Plains and Canada have started using this system. So hay bales are placed across paddocks before winter hay feeding begins. And then the cattle are allowed access to the bales at a controlled rate using strip grazing. So, you would allow the cattle to have access to however many bales are needed for the stocking rate that you have, and they would be located in a strip where their water source is. After a few days, the electrical fence is moved and cattle now have access to a new bale. So different benefits such as placing those hay bales on pasture before the winter time, and where we are, we have very wet winters. That can be very beneficial in reducing disturbance and compaction. You have manure distribution across the pasture when you can place these bales in areas of the pasture that potentially are lower in different nutrients, so encouraging the cattle to be there as well as hay residue. So it can be a really beneficial system, and with my research for my PhD was specifically to kind of see if it could be beneficial for producers here in Virginia. Our winters look a lot different than those in northern Great Plains and Canada, where this system is beneficial. I mean, we don't have frozen ground 5 months of the year. It's very wet. We can get a lot of precipitation. So I did that starting in 2021 at the Shenandoah Valley AREC and wrapped up my PhD in the May of 2024, and I got to draw some really great conclusions about the study that I'd be happy to share.
And Summer, with we really emphasize 4 principles, and I think with soil health, biology is really more and more important, and one of the principles being energizing with diversity, with crop rotations, integrating livestock, and can you speak to why that's so important? I think like here in the Shenandoah Valley, we have such a rolling topography with hills and valleys, and sometimes pastures can be low in soil fertility. So the importance of having livestock on them is critical.
Absolutely. So when thinking about, the 4 soil principles and rotational bale grazing, I can kind of speak to each of those, and then we'll focus a little bit on, integrating livestock as well. But, when we think about, minimize soil disturbance, rotational bale grazing does that with reducing machinery on the pasture. You're setting your bales out, once, as well as, distributing livestock across the system for continuous soil cover. So, you're feeding directly on the pasture. So residue from wasted hay and that manure is going directly to the soil to promote the growth of forage. And a big concern with rotational bale grazing is, I'm placing these bales in the middle of my pasture. Is it going to leave, a spot from, the cattle grazing it or where we've placed it? And, that first season, you may have a little bit of a, bale spot, but it's shown in research studies that after that second year, that residual hay and that manure waste really goes to work. And producers have said, where those hay bales were placed is usually their best forage. Living roots, so allowing, perennial forages to recover by practicing rotations. And then when we think about biodiversity and integrating, livestock, the biggest thing with rotational bale grazing is, redistributing that nutrients as evenly as possible over the whole entire system. What's coming from that animal is gold. That manure is gold. It has all those nutrients, right? So if we can put them, where we need them, it can really be beneficial, and then in turn reduce reliance on synthetic fertilizers. And rotational bale grazing allows us to do this in a way that can help reduce runoff, build our soil organic matter over time. A really interesting thing I saw in my study was the sacrifice paddocks that I was using have been sacrifice paddocks for the last 20 years. So a lot of manure deposition in that area. That area had so much organic matter compared to other areas of the farm. And surprisingly, when we were doing these runoff experiments, in those sacrifice paddocks, we had a decent amount of infiltration because of that organic matter. If we can spread that to our whole operation with practices like rotational bale grazing and using livestock as a tool, I think that's pretty magical. Livestock aren't the best land managers, but they're great land management tools. And I'm taking that from Dr. John Fike. That's one of his sayings, and I think it's has a lot of volume, with using these livestock and integrating them into the system to increase, nutrient cycling, increase organic matter, in turn increasing soil life.
We're talking today with Dr. Summer Thomas, Education and Outreach Specialist with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. And Summer, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your research at a lot of people call it the Cyrus McCormick Farm there in Stills Tavern, the Shenandoah Valley Agricultural Research and Extension Center, concerning rotational bale grazing, a lot of farmers get caught up in the numbers. You mentioned organic matter. What are the numbers when it comes to your research improving organic matter as a result of rotational bale grazing? Do you have any numbers that you can think of?
Sure. So for my specific study, I wasn't specifically looking at organic matter, but the best is yet to come because this project is being continued. And there is a PhD student now that's currently looking at rotational bale grazing and specifically looking at changes in soil organic matter. For me, I was really focusing on looking at phosphorus and potassium and looking at the distribution of phosphorus and potassium across the system and placing bales in areas where we were low, specifically in phosphorus, and seeing if we could increase phosphorus and potassium in those areas while mitigating it or not increasing it where we didn't necessarily need those nutrients. And in a hay bale, there is a lot of potassium. So the results of the study, we were able to, increase potassium where we had placed our bales and not where we didn't want to. Phosphorus increased across the whole system, even where bales were not placed. But I think with a longer study, this was just a small 2-year study, we would really start to see those differences. So stay tuned. The best is yet to come with specific numbers of soil organic matter. Katie Hayes, she'll be continuing that, so look out for it.
That's awesome. It's exciting. We know, Summer, that the social side is also important. Do you think, are you seeing producers interested in this, willing to change their practices?
Definitely. So what was great about doing my research at Steele's Tavern was where most of my paddocks was right beside 81. So it was basically a huge billboard for rotational bale grazing. So producers at different field days that I would attend or, seeing people, they'd be like, oh, you're that girl that, has those hay bales out. What the heck are you doing? And, that was a great opportunity. They had an interest. It sparked their interest. And we got to talk about, what rotational bale grazing is. But what's great about rotational bale grazing is it's not necessarily a one-fits-all system. It can really be, changed to fit different operations, whether it's a small operation, whether it's a large operation. And, producers had a lot of interest in it. Some producers say, well, I've been doing similarly with rolling out bales, but I'm not necessarily, soil testing to see if that's where I should be. But, that's a good idea. And a lot of people have started to get interested in rotational bale grazing, especially because hay is so expensive. Feeding these livestock throughout the winter, we want to minimize that as much as possible. We want to feed as little hay as possible, but when we do, it can be expensive. So, that kind of goes into that business side and kind of combining business and conservation and soil health and putting those two things together. Rotational bale grazing, I believe, it is a tie between business and, land stewardship.
In summer, one of our previous guests, Mike Phillips, always talks about feeding the above ground livestock and feeding the below ground livestock. I'm sure you saw different dynamics with your research and share anything that you want regarding just some of those dynamics.
Sure. So, if we want healthy animals, you have to have healthy plants. And if we want healthy plants, we have to have healthy soil. And rotational bale grazing, that hay specifically is, yes, feeding animals above ground. But it's also the residue that you are leaving is feeding and is a source for those microorganisms below ground. So it's really a system where, you're going to see the benefits potentially above ground first, but then in the long run, it's a long-term investment with rotational bale grazing. Can see, how those microbes, how that hay residue, how that manure distribution is benefiting them, which in turn can increase water infiltration, increase the forage growth that's present in those different pastures. So you're kind of taking what you were doing and one paddock and starting to spread it across the whole operation.
Once again, we're talking with Dr. Summer Thomas, Education and Outreach Specialist with Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Just a couple of minutes remaining, Summer, and I wanted to ask you about the outreach part of your job. You know, when you're doing outreach concerning something really popular like college football or, I don't know, NASCAR or, you know, the state fair, something, outreach is pretty easy. But how do you do it in regards to soil health?
So that's like, for me, you know, soil has always been exciting, but I have to sometimes take a step back and think, you know, how can I make this exciting for everybody? And this is where I'm going to kind of refer to what we talked about, you know, last week with thinking about, you know, putting things into perspective with soil health, maybe doing different demonstrations or, you know, making an analogy so people start to, you know, get a different idea, or talk about, you know, with people, you know, what their interests are. And then usually, majority of the time, it always can come back, you know, that how soil affects that, or how soil is affecting their daily life. So kind of finding that connection and tying it back to talk about soil health, or putting it into a different perspective. And that's what I love about my job. I love trying to kind of almost be a detective and find ways that we can make this exciting for everybody. And as Mary had mentioned, when we were at the youth conservation camp, at the end of the day, a student did come up to us and say, soil is a lot more interesting than I thought. And I just wanted to hug him and just say, you've made my whole day, week. And that's when it really clicked, you know, why I do what I do and why I love it so much.
It has been a real pleasure having a conversation with you. Dr. Summer Thomas, Education and Outreach Specialist with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. And Summer, thank you for everything you do, and thanks for being our special guest.
Thank you.
Eric and Mary, we'll catch y'all on the next one.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Summer.
For the Soil, a conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. And if you have a specific question about soil health, just contact your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts, all rights reserved. For the Soil, a conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii.